Insecure deserialization is a relatively new vulnerability to the OWASP top 10 list. It's becoming sort of increasingly more popular, and although it sits at number 8 on this list only, it's a fairly common vulnerability to see in a lot of different applications because of the process of serialization and deserialization being so central to a lot of applications that utilize object-oriented programming. So we're going to take a look at what deserialization really is and understand how it's used to exploit vulnerabilities and what we can do about it. So first off, what is serialization? So in web applications, we typically use objects to store data. When we store data in objects, we need some sort of way of transmitting them either into a database or across the wire to some sort of receiver. So maybe if we're communicating between like the client and the server, if the client creates like an object, they need to send it off to the server. Serialization is the way that that's done. And what we typically do is we convert the object into a byte stream. That byte stream is sent off to the receiver. The receiver will receive it, and then they'll convert it back into an object. So this is really just a way of being able to store and transmit data when it's stored in terms of objects. So deserialization is, of course, the reverse process of serialization. So when the recipient receives the serialized object, they can turn that byte stream back into the object. And typically the process is like, so say we have an object that has two properties, right? We turn it into a byte stream. We send the first property and the second property. We might put the object at the very beginning, and then when the person who receives it, they see what kind of object it is. They see the properties in the byte stream, and they just build the object based on that information. So the typical flow is going to be that the sender will serialize an object, they'll send it off, the receiver will receive the serialized object, they'll deserialize the byte stream and back into an object, and in the end, they'll be able to transmit data in this way. So the vulnerability here is that an attacker can send their own data to be serialized, and then the deserialization process will be the portion that gets compromised. When the server pieces together the byte stream, we can potentially input data that is insecure. And if the server doesn't do proper validation on that data, it will potentially be able to cause some form of impact, whether it be escalation of privilege, remote code execution, information disclosure. There's a lot of different potential impacts of this type of vulnerability. Just to give you a bit of an idea, when you have escalation of privilege, it typically results of like tweaking a property of the object that's being sent off to escalate your privilege to say that you're an administrator or something like that. When this sort of thing happens, when the server receives the data, it will simply deserialize the object. It will turn it back into the object itself, and since it doesn't do any verification, it will just accept the object as is, assuming that everything you provided it is correct. And this will allow it to essentially escalate the privileges for you. Remote code execution is a little bit more tricky. If we have a situation where we're sending like a command in an object, for instance, you could potentially pull off like a command injection by changing that command. And there's a few other different instances, like if we call specific functions or specific methods, we may be able to modify those pieces to be able to do remote code executions. And information disclosure, of course, comes from the idea of, if you send off maybe an object that has an ID in it, you might be able to alter the ID to get different sets of information out of that object. So those are the typical sort of impacts of this type of vulnerability. So to give you an example, cookies are typically a way that object serialization and deserialization might be exploited. So suppose that we have a cookie for a web application that has a user, a role, and a password hash. If someone has a cookie like the one in the second bullet where it says Alice and she's a user and her password is 1234, we might be able to modify it to say change the user, change the role to administrator, and send it off to the server. When the server receives this and deserializes it, it won't be verified server-side because we're just going to assume that the server is trusting the data, in which case it will see that an admin is trying to make an action, and it will accept it because an administrator will have the ability to do that action, which will mean that they'll get admin access without actually having an admin account. So this is a very common way that object deserialization might be used to exploit a system to do like an escalation of privilege. So the main way to mitigate this sort of problem is to always verify user input. In the cookies example, when we send off that cookie and it gets deserialized by the server, the first thing the server should do is take that data and verify it against a database or something that it stores and has control over to see if that user is actually an administrator or not. In this sort of way, we'll be able to ensure that they aren't able to escalate their privileges because we're verifying it in a location that isn't controlled by the user. Similar sort of idea, if they provide you any sort of input, we should be filtering it out for any sort of commands or anything like that. We shouldn't ever use user input in a way that it might be able to get exploited. So we never trust user input, and we always validate user input. Aside from this, web application firewalls could be a good additional mitigating factor for these sort of risks. It doesn't necessarily solve the problem because even if you have a firewall, it doesn't mean that every single attack is going to get caught. There could be a new type of attack that your firewall isn't prepared for, and they might be able to get through. So really the best way to mitigate this problem is to keep your validation on server side and always verify user input. So this gives you an idea of what object deserialization is really about and how these vulnerabilities can exist on a system. So from this, you should be able to understand the general ways that you can exploit this type of vulnerability and understand how it can be mitigated and patched on the application server side.